All right, camera's running, so let's get down to business. We are drawing to the end of the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, which hopefully this year, as in previous years, you have come to appreciate more and more is not simply a book of rules, but we're going to be looking in this week's parasha of Behar into something that might feel a little bit, well, at least anachronistic, but also perhaps alien from us. Hands up, everyone here who's a farmer. Okay, we got one hand. Right? Hands up, everyone here who has their food completely and utterly dependent upon their farming.
All of us.
All of us are utterly and completely dependent upon farming somebody's farm. It's just a question of whether or not it's our own. So hopefully with that in mind, at least as our starting point, you will be able to find a relationship to the text that we are about to encounter. And hopefully as we go through, you'll realize that you don't have to be a farmer to appreciate what God is trying to teach us here. And you don't have to be a farmer to apply what God is trying to teach us here either. So with that as a little bit of an introduction, let's get down to work. We are on Parashat Behar, which is chapter 25 in Leviticus. And we're going to start from the beginning. Bless you. And that's going to be page 738. Page 738, chapter 25, Leviticus. Everyone set? Good. Who's my volunteer for the reading of the Torah in English? Anyone? Anyone? Bueller? Nikki, thanks.
The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai. Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land that I assign to you, the land shall observe the Sabbath of the Lord. 6 years you may sow your field, and 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather in the yield. But in the 7th year the land shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, a Sabbath of the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest or gather the grapes of your untrimmed vines. It shall be a year of complete rest for the land. But you may eat whatever the land during its Sabbath will produce. You, your male and female slaves, the hired and bound laborers who live with you, and your cattle and the beasts in your land may eat all its yield.
All right, so let's pause for a second and unpack that. So what are we talking about here in sort of the standard layman's term? If you're a college professor, every few years you get a sabbatical. Well, we invented the term. And the first sabbatical that God ordains is not for professors, it's not for teachers, it's for dirt. It's for the dirt. The land gets a sabbatical. So how does this work? Well, you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years where you're doing your normal farming. For every 1 year that you get rest for land. Make sense? Okay, no problems? Well, what's
about a year's hiatus between the time you rest the land and when you get started.
okay? You got a year's
You
hiatus.
start harvesting again
So the problem is, what am I eating?
after you eat all that.
What's that?
Other land?
Other land?
I mean, other parts of your land, you have.
Ah,
and you-
so Sandy, you're thinking about crop rotation. And indeed, in most ancient world cultures, and certainly in the modern world, we have series where you might have one field that you leave fallow for 1 year and you farm the other ones, and then the next year you farm that one and leave a different one empty, and then the next year you farm a different one and leave another one empty, and you rotate your crops, and you rotate which fields you're using. This is not that.
Okay.
This is, you work all the land that you want to work, or should be working, depending upon the health of the land biologically. 7th year, you don't farm any land. Not rotation, complete abstention.
Do all the farmers in the same area follow exactly the same years?
If by the same area you mean the land of Israel, yes.
Yes.
So all the farmers in all of the land of Israel all follow the same cessation of farming every 7th year.
That same year.
Same year, same time frame. They blow the horn and everyone stops. And they don't start up again until after that year is done. So? So what are you eating?
What you've stored.
Okay, so we've got a couple options. One of them is we're going to see a bumper crop, right? That if in year 6 we can consistently rely on harvesting more than usual, then we know that you can survive long on what you've stored. After all, Egypt went through 7 years of bumper crops and then went through 7 years of almost nothing, and they did okay by carefully storing and rationing. So if this is a predictable cycle, and you can predict that there will always be a bumper crop in year number 6, then you're not so bad.
You can't predict that.
But you can't predict that. So what else did the Torah just tell us about what we're eating in the 7th year?
It just comes up by itself.
Okay,
No,
7th year, you also get, what's the right way to call this?
Volunteer.
Natural growth. Right? In the usual course of history, we stopped being hunter-gatherers and we became farmers. And in the hunter-gatherer phase, you would go out each day and you'd find a few berries and you'd find a couple acorns and you'd mash them up and you'd make your acorn berry bread, and that was what you did. And then the next day you went out and gathered a little more, and that's what you ate that day. And the third day you went out and gathered and you couldn't find anything, you were hungry. So the natural growth, whatever you're able to gather from the land that came up without you plowing it, sowing it, fertilizing it, weeding it, watering it, and all those other things, whatever just naturally comes up, you can have that, says the Torah.
Well, I have an example. I've been growing in a pot garden tomatoes. Well,
Mhm.
all of a sudden, oh look, and here's a tomato plant coming up around it. So that would be
Mhm.
something I could naturally eat. I didn't stick it there, it somehow came off.
You didn't stick it there, you're not tending it, you could just eat it. And we're going to get into the details of this natural growth idea in just a bit in the commentaries, but I want to make sure we understand the basic issue.
First year, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, it's the first year of the next cycle that's the problem.
Yeah, that's what.
But here's the problem, exactly, Michael. The next 6 years, you're thinking, phew, I made it past the year when we couldn't harvest anything. But what else are you supposed to be doing this year? Planting. Because the planting for 1 year is what you harvest the next, and the planting for that year is what you harvest the next, and so on and so forth. So here, when you're not planting, you get to here, and there's no food. So okay, fine. There were probably extra seeds that had fallen from your wheat when you were harvesting last time. You know, they sort of shook loose because we didn't have big combines that pulled up everything. It was just a guy with a scythe, and you'd throw the sheaf on your shoulder, and some of the kernels would fall out. And so okay, fine. 7th year, some of that's coming up naturally. We're okay. But by the end of the 7th year, you haven't harvested anything. I mean, you haven't planted anything. The beginning of the next cycle, nothing's coming up. And in fact, nothing will come up with your care, except for very fast crops, and everything else is going to be in year number 2. Because you're planting this year, and it'll start growing, or start being harvested in the next year. So you got a few fast crops that you can get in that'll help, but it's really quite a long wait until you get back to having a regular agricultural cycle. This is not just you take one year off. It really does throw a huge monkey wrench into the entire business of farming, which is why you don't see any modern farmers in California or Florida or anywhere else in the Midwest following this model, because it's really, really disruptive.
This was directed to the Israelites.
Correct.
What about the other people that were living on that land?
Nope. You don't get to have foreign workers do it for you.
Okay.
When did aquaculture arise?
Long before this. Agriculture was already.
Aquaculture.
Oh, aquaculture. Like fish ponds
Well,
or
no,
hydroponics.
Hydroponics.
Right. So that did arise a bit later. But what did arise, and you got to get a shakaf, what did arise before that was the idea of putting down a synthetic dirt, synthetic soil. They would take straw and hay and layer it over the top of the field, and you'd grow in that rather than in the ground.
So you put your seeds on
Growing
that.
above the
Exactly. It's an elevator. So you got your regular dirt, right? And this is all your stones and dirt down in the ground. And then you take hay and straw and you bury the ground. in a thick mat of all of this, and then you'd grow
So
in
you
that.
made your seeds in straw
Yeah.
Exactly. And then it was growing elevated.
Water and everything.
And you'd make it, and you'd water it and,
Where in the cycle can you do that?
well, you could do this right here. Because you're not growing in the dirt.
In the 7th
You're
year?
not growing on the land.
Okay.
You're letting the land rest. You're using a synthetic layer of topsoil, if you will, for your growing. Not exactly the best high yield agricultural technique though. So even if this works, it is extremely labor intensive to get going, and you don't get the same kind of results as you would from the dirt itself. That's why you don't see big
You
farms
don't get-
out there using hay as their
You
topsoil.
don't get the taste either.
Well, I don't know exactly how it affects the taste,
Yeah, it
but
does.
it's not going to be great because what's coming out of that hay is not the same level of nutrients that would be in the ground.
Now, I assume this is a hukim,
Which,
this Sabbath year.
I mean, having this as a law that we are.
Right, it's a hukim that
Yep.
we don't necessarily understand.
Oh no, we're going to understand it.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm just wondering, they've come up with scientific reasons why you should rest on
Mhm.
Shabbat. Have they come up with scientific reasons to show the beneficiency
So there
of
is
resting the soil?
very clear evidence of why the land does need to be rested during the agricultural process. That if you just keep farming and farming and farming the same piece of land and never allow it to rest, never allow it to grow plants like clover that put nutrients back into the soil, that the land will eventually become dead and it will not be able to grow anything out of it. What they haven't been able to prove through agricultural science is this cycle. Because as Sandy was alluding to, the more natural way to do it is you have one field that you're not using this year. That way you're not shutting down the entire cycle and then having to wait for the reboot. You just have a sort of rotational process to allow it to always be producing, and you never have to go hoping that you will eventually be able to have enough food at the other end of this process before you just have to wait a few more years and start all over again. So yeah, it's as a chok, as a law that doesn't provide rational explanation. Obviously, it's very true, but we're going to see that there are some definite rational explanations given by the Torah and by our commentators. But to do that, we need to keep reading. So we're on verse 8.
You shall count off 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the period of 7 weeks of years gives you a total of 49 years.
Right, 7 weeks. The word week here is being used as the number 7. 7 times 7, 49.
Then you shall sound the horn loud. In the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, the day of atonement, you shall have the horn sounded throughout your land, and you shall hallow the 50th year. You shall proclaim release throughout the land for all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you shall return to his holding, and each of you shall return to his family. That 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. You shall not sow, neither shall you reap the aftergrowth. Oh, neither shall you reap the aftergrowth, or harvest the untrimmed vines, for it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You may only eat the growth direct from the field. In this year of jubilee.
Okay, pause there real quick. So we've got our, let me just erase this a little bit to make it a little bit easier. We got our basic sabbatical cycle, right? 6 working, 1 off. 6 working, 1 off. We take all of that and we times it by 7. And at the end of that process, 7 sabbatical cycles, we get the Jubilee. And the Jubilee is the super duper sabbatical moment, where not only do we let the land rest, but what else happens?
Let the slaves loose.
The slaves are released. People who are indentured servants that are working for other people that have had to sell themselves during the previous 49 years at some point are freed. And?
Well, it's an economic
You go back to your land.
And you shall return to his holding. Each of you shall return to his family.
So anything that you own goes back to its original owner.
Land, right? So let's say, for example, in the 3rd sabbatical cycle, I hit it big. I found gold on my land, and I am just flush with cash. And my neighbors, they're not doing so well, and in fact their farms are failing, and I say, don't worry, I'll buy your farms and you, and you can keep working them, and I will enjoy much of the proceeds, and that will make me wealthier during this time. And if you were ever able to redeem yourself, as we'll see, you can redeem yourself, but in the meantime, you'll be taken care of, I'll get richer, no problem. Right? Well, at the end of 49 years, they go in Jerusalem for Yom Kippur, and all of those neighbors around you whose land you bought, and all of the people who are working for you as indentured servants, what gets called a slave, now say, oh, okay, it's done, thank you very much. We'll be taking our house back now, and we'll be taking our fields back now, and we're going to go back to work for ourselves.
Okay.
That's what's being described here. They go free, the land goes back to them in ownership, and you're done.
And it's the ownership within the last 50 years, right? I mean, it doesn't go all the way back to the tribes.
Well, if this is done every 50 years,
Yeah.
then it is the ownership that goes back to the original tribal allotments.
Oh, okay.
And all debts are paid.
Right? The only distinction between this and the tribal allotment is that through the laws of inheritance, the land would have been subdivided more times in the middle.
Yes, it's complicated.
Getting complicated. and not only getting complicated, but how do you feel the guy who had struck it rich and had enlarged his holdings and improved the land and done all of that, how's he feeling at the end of 49 years?
Share the wealth.
Share the wealth. Yeah, that's a positive way you might look.
Social system.
I was gonna say, exactly.
It's like, wait a minute, is this Karl Marx? Is this socialism?
That's where you learned it.
Where's the reset button, right? I didn't know that life had a do-over. But that is what the Torah is talking about. And we'll come back to why in just a few minutes, but I do want to get a few more verses under our belt. 13.
In the year of Jubilee, in this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his holding. When you sell property to your neighbor or buy any from your neighbor, you shall not wrong one another. In buying from your neighbor, you shall deduct only for the number of years since the Jubilee. And in selling to you, he shall charge you only for the remaining crop years. The more such years, the higher the price you pay. The fewer such years, the lower the price. For what he is selling you is a number of harvests. Do not wrong one another, but fear your God, for I, the Lord, am your God.
All right, quick little aside here, because we obviously need to explain, if I'm buying your piece of land under this system, I'm not buying your piece of land. I am renting your piece of land. I'm leasing it for the option to be able to harvest or plant and harvest as I wish for however many years there are between now and the end of the Jubilee. And that means the price has to be set accordingly. You can't say, this is the most amazing piece of land ever, look at the view, you and your grandchildren and great-grandchildren will all be able to enjoy this in wonderful timeshare, sorry, wrong pitch, and the price is only $1 million. You can't do that. You can say, this land typically produces, $30,000 worth of growth every year, and I think that because there are 10 years left till the Jubilee, that it's worth, therefore, $300,000. And then you can haggle. We like haggling. But that would be the beginning of the haggle, is what you think the land produces per harvest and how many harvests there are between now and the Jubilee. Because you can't sell anything more than that. That's it, as far as what you are selling. Make sense?
Can you sell the land during the Jubilee year?
You mean during the Jubilee year itself?
Yes.
No, actually the rabbis do talk about that, and you're not allowed to sell during the Jubilee year to restart it. It was considered akin to during the time of Jeremiah, where people let their slaves free and then quickly went and re-enslaved them. The whole point is that there's supposed to be a reset, not perpetual transference of property.
Well, so then can you sell it to somebody else?
You mean, but again, during the Jubilee?
Yeah.
Well, you shouldn't conceivably need to. So there was a presumption in the ancient world that the only reason you'd be selling your land was because you couldn't afford to work it and feed yourself.
The taxes are really high.
Taxes were never higher than what the land was producing. So if you had a failed year and nothing came in, your tithes were nothing. And on the other hand, if you had a great year and tons came in, then your tithes were a percent of that. So there was never the modern phenomenon of having paid off your mortgage and having, got all your bills down, and then someone racking up the property value, and all of a sudden you can't pay your property taxes. That didn't occur in the ancient world. So that you couldn't be forced off your land in such a way. But if you failed to harvest over and over again, then you could starve yourself off your own land, and then you would have to sell it. But selling was always considered a desperate move, not something that you would just do to raise a little capital. Make sense? Okay, onward.
You shall observe my laws and faithfully keep my rules, that you may live upon the land in security. The land shall yield its fruit, and you shall eat your fill, and you shall live upon it in security. And should you ask, what are we to eat in the 7th year? We may neither sow nor gather in our crops. I will ordain my blessing for you in the 6th year, so that it shall yield a crop sufficient for 3 years. When you sow in the 8th year, you will still be eating old grain of that crop. You will be eating the old until the 9th year, until its crops come in.
Everyone follow that little diagram that I just erased a second ago? But as you see, God's got us covered. God understands how agriculture works too. This isn't like some, ivory tower deity that's giving laws that have no connection to reality. And God says, don't worry. 6th year, you're going to get a big crop. And 7th and 8th year, while you're going through this period, you will be fine. You'll still be eating your stores by the time the 9th year harvest starts rolling in. Everyone feels a sense of relief? Or are we all still feeling a little nervous about this notion of not planting and just saying, oh, I'm sure it'll all be fine?
This forces you into planning ahead.
Yeah, well, really being a farmer should already force you into planning ahead, but this even more so is highlighting a dependence upon the long-term outlook of what's coming down the pipe. Yeah.
If you save a little bit from each year,
Yeah.
just that the next year, it kind of paces forward.
I've heard that works with paychecks too.
Yes.
Save a little bit.
But it could be like the manna. They gathered too much, it rotted.
But with the manna, they gathered too much when they weren't supposed to.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
And we're going to get to the
It's
gathering in
saying-
just a minute, because you've already, I can hear from the murmuring around the table, have been going, well, wait a minute, didn't it say in the 7th year not to harvest? But didn't it also say you could eat the growth? A little
You can't do that on the Jubilee.
But it says don't harvest but eat the growth. We'll get to that, okay? We'll get to that. And then in the process, hopefully we will uncover some insights here.
But what a wonderful thing is happening, and this never occurred to me. We're returning to total dependence on God.
Yes?
Our families are put back together.
Mm-hmm.
Our weight control is under.
Nothing like a little starvation to take the pounds off.
But there's so many huge positives about this.
There are. The only negative is
Rather than
the
being
massive
frustrated.
stress and fear, which I think is probably the emotion most people are going to relate to.
Our faith in God is.
I mean, imagine just for a minute, right? If I told you, imagine for just a minute, every 7 years, you guys get to or have to take a year off of work. Right? You have to take a year off of work. And no salary. Don't worry. God will provide a lot extra in the 6th, and there'll be something that'll come along a little bit here and there, but you won't be working in the 7th year.
Get to do something else.
And well, of course you get to do something else. Who here signs up for that plan? I don't know, no fair retired people saying it. I'm talking about when you were in your prime of the working career, whether it was both of you and your spouse working or whether it was just one of you working. Who here would think every 7 years, let's roll the dice. Let's take the whole year off. Very few.
I've done that
Once. And I'm sure it took a lot of planning.
I
And
didn't think
that's why it only happened once.
it was
It's
Israel.
You went to Israel for a year, exactly. So it is a beautiful idea, and you can see what you can accomplish when you do that. That's different than I've got 2 weeks off in the summer. And speaking from personal experience, going to Israel for 2 weeks and going to Israel for a year are very different experiences and have a very different impact on the person. And doing anything for a year will have a bigger impact on a person than just that. but it's still so scary. It's still so hard. So let's go ahead. Because of time, I want to go ahead and get to some of our commentaries. I will have to fill in a couple of the passages we didn't get to read as we go around, because one of the things that gets mentioned, where did I put my pen? One of the things that gets mentioned is that the land goes back to everyone, but the houses in cities do not.
Yeah, I knew there was a difference.
Right? So if you are living near town, well, we'll call it Ear, city in Hebrew. If you're living near the town of Ear, and you've got a lovely little corner house right here, and you sell that, you've got a year to redeem it. You've got a year to say, no, actually I don't want to sell that house. I want it back. Here's the money back. I want my house back. But after that first year is up, it belongs to whoever you sold it to forever. Jubilee comes along, you do not get that house back. It is owned, lock, stock, barrel, permanently.
So it's only farmland that you.
But if you have a nice field outside the city of Ear with a lovely little farmhouse on it, and you sell that field and house, Jubilee comes along, it goes back to you. Remember, the word sell is a bit tricky, but you remember you're selling it for a certain number of harvests, however many years till the Jubilee. So if you're selling this in the 47th year of the cycle, you're not going to get a lot of money for it. And if you sell it in the first year of the cycle, you're probably going to get a lot. So don't feel that the person who bought it is being cheated if you followed what God said, that you're not cheating each other and not deceptive about how many harvests are left or what the productivity of the land is. The person who bought it knew exactly what to expect, of exactly how many years and what they would find, what they would normally expect to get from that land. So you are leasing it at a fair price. So if you lease it for 50 years or 48 years, or if you lease it for 5 years, the amount will be prorated. But this returns to you always. This, you've got 1 year to change your mind and redeem it. We'll come back to why at the end of the studies. Question?
Just, it's a walled city, does he differentiate?
Well, it's a walled city in the text, and it's traditionally held as being a walled city by rabbinic law, and we'll see what the rabbis were thinking of why they made that so clear when we get to our final commentary. Don't look now. Okay, so let's start off with a couple of the positive ideas of this before we get into the challenging aspects of the sabbatical and jubilee cycle. All right, Nikki, do you want to just keep reading for the sake of not making me hunt for another volunteer?
During this whole year, the farmer, instead of serving the soil, which requires cultivation, will turn his efforts to serving God directly instead. Just as the weekly Sabbath is a day set aside for intensive service of the Lord, so the sabbatical year is to serve the same purpose.
All right, so Sforno, based upon his understanding of Shabbat, says, look, 1 day a week, we're not allowed to work. And because we're not allowed to work, and we're not then a slave to our work, we can properly turn ourselves to God and serve God. And if that's good once a week, imagine what the effect would be if it happened for 365 days every 7 years, so that everyone had at least one slab of time every 7 years where the field wasn't calling to them, where they did not need to run out every morning, break of dawn, feed the chickens, milk the cows, hoe the weeds, water this, fix the fence, all those things until they were dead tired at night and fall asleep, and then wake up the next morning and do it again. Imagine if they had one whole year where they didn't have to do that. Sforno says it would be a spiritual awakening for everyone to experience, to have that opportunity. I think he's got a point. It's still scary, but he's got a point that there is definitely a personal spiritual benefit to this.
So everybody's following the same template.
Right.
Which means that.
The holiday sites are going to be packed. All the vacation hotels.
Farmers
Mm-hmm.
would have the same 365
Yep.
days
Right.
to volunteer work.
To do volunteer work, to study Torah, to travel as needed for whatever was inspiring them. Absolutely.
Could work at something else.
Okay. So one thing that Sforno's not exactly clear on, because he's not trying to argue to farmers, he's trying to argue to the people of his own day about the importance of serving God. But yes, in practice, I would imagine that most people who were living as subsistence farmers, if they were forced to take a year off from farming, would take up basket weaving. Would take up pottery. Not because it was an art form, but because they could sell their pots, because they could sell their baskets. They would do some other, in quote, productive or employable labor during this year of no farming. Because there's lots of things you can do in a community that don't require farming, and many of them will get you paid. And many of them will get you paid and allow you to buy food that came from outside the land of Israel. So there are definitely ways around this that indeed many people would probably have taken. But that's why perhaps Sforno, although I think his insight is very good and inspiring, is probably slightly off the mark of the reason for why the sabbatical would have been put in place. Because a person might ignore this, I don't have to work for the year, so I get to go do something spiritual and do something less than spiritual. They might just sit and watch TV for a year, even if they don't get a job. So he's inspiring, but probably not 100% accurate for God's reasoning. Make sense? Okay, onward.
I, God, am both buyer and seller. This is why I am meticulous and adamant that neither practice be tolerated.
Neither practice be tolerated is referring back to our quote where it says that you will have to be very honest. Remember, there was like a whole paragraph when selling your land, that you have to be very clear that you're selling the harvests, you're not selling the land. You have to be very clear how many harvests are left, that all of this has to be above board, and everything has to go back in the 50th year. No calling foul when the Jubilee comes along. So God is trying to say, I am very, very explicit in all of this because I have a vested interest in looking out for the buyer and the seller. Because you are the buyer and the seller of the land. From Sforno's comment here. Who's buying the land? What? God. Who's selling the land?
God.
Right. Because who owns the land? God. Right? And this is a theme that we're going to begin to develop here. So Sforno makes it sort of casually, not casually, but he makes it a little bit of an aside, but it's going to be going to much more depth. The reason why this system can work, the reason why God has the authority to put this in place, the reason why the Jubilee can come along and take land that you paid for and give it back to someone else who sold it to you, is because you never owned it and neither did he. God owns the land. You're just tenants. Okay? Okay. Onward.
The Holy One, blessed be he, said, sow for 6 years and rest in the seventh, in order that you will know that I gave you this inheritance. It wasn't by your choice or request, rather I gave it to you. You have not done so, followed the cycle, but have sinned and not given sabbatical or jubilee, and it resulted in your exile.
All right. So Midrash Haggadah gets down and clear. Later on in the parasha, you would see that failure to follow this rule is going to be explicitly linked to the threat of exile from the land, because once we are kicked off the land, all of these number sevens that we ignored, the land gets to have because we're not there to farm it. Right? It's make-up time. Right? If you make someone work 24 hours a day for 7 days a week, when you finally send them to the hospital with that kind of work schedule, they're making up for all the lost time they should have had off that you were stealing from them, and you will suffer because they're not around to give you even a little bit of work in the meantime. So the exile comes as a very midah keneged midah, measure against measure. You refuse to allow the land to rest, well then the land's going to force you to let it rest by kicking you out. Make sense? But again, we come back to this notion that God gave us this land. He didn't give it to us as a freeholding gift that we had no responsibilities to. This is a loan. Right? If I loan you my car, because yours is in the shop, I'm allowed to tell you how to drive it. I'm allowed to tell you what you should do with it. Okay, you can borrow my car, but you got to park it in the garage, or you can't park it underneath some horrible drippy tree, or make sure that you always lock it, or don't run go into certain neighborhoods, or whatever your rules might be. It's my car. I can tell you what you can do with it while you're using it. Anyone who's ever had a teenage driver knows this. And if you don't want to follow those rules, then I'll take the car back, and you can find your own car. And that's what he's saying. He's not, you didn't earn this land. I'm not giving it to you as a free gift. It's not because you asked nicely that I'm giving it to you. I'm giving it to you because that's what I'm establishing as my covenant. And that means you follow my rules. But we still haven't got, even though we've got the authority now, we still haven't got to the reason of why God would have this particular and rather unique set of rules for governing the land. So let's see if we can dig more.
Why does the Torah say sow for 6 years and rest in the seventh? God is saying, understand, I made my world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. This land too that I give to you, 6 years I will allow you to blow.
Plow.
And sow.
Sorry for the typo. We don't actually blow on land, we plow the land.
Well, maybe the wind or something.
Yeah, no, it's plow.
Well, and plow and sow, and in the seventh cease from the plowing and sowing, or else the debt will be paid off by your exile.
Right. So God is, again, this other set from Midrash Agadah is trying to reinforce this notion. You're only here at my request. Why is it 6 and 7? Because I want you to recognize in this my ownership of the world. Right? In 6 days I made the world, and in 7th days I rested. That is a signature line for God to remind all of us that God created the world. So not only does God have the authority to tell us what to do with the land because he gave it to us, God has the authority to tell us what to do with the land because God made it, along with the whole rest of the universe. That's kind of heavy duty, right? I'm not just loaning you my car, I made this car that I'm loaning to you. So I really, really, really get to tell you what to do with it. And if not, then there will be consequences, I think is the modern polite term for punishment. Make sense? Okay. But what about this eating thing? What about how this actually works? What are we meant to feel from it other than that we are dependent on God? Because that's a very important spiritual lesson, but it's not the only way we could feel it. We can get that feeling of dependence on God simply by saying a blessing before each time we eat. This is going to create a different atmosphere altogether. That's going to give us a much deeper, hopefully, spiritual truth.
What is meant by the food being finished? Means that after a certain time he must finish with the various kinds of produce in his house, abandoning them to all comers. This is called removal in the technical language of the rabbinic sources. This does not mean that once removed, the produce may not be eaten or used in any way and must be destroyed. Rather, it must be removed from his control, leaving it free for the poor or anyone else. Deuteronomy 26:13. The poor are those who glean in the fields of others, while the rich are the owners of the fields themselves. But during this year, they too glean what they have technically abandoned in their fields.
Okay, pause there. Let's make sure we understand what this is Ramban, Nachmanides is trying to say. Anyone want to try and put that into English? I know I already did, but into English? A little confusing?
You can't.
Well, you're going to have to bow to be like the poor.
And how are you going to feel that most acutely? Well, you're going to feel it
You got to go out and glean.
right here.
Yeah.
So remember how we said no harvest, but gather. What the rabbis said, and what Ramban is trying to summarize for us from a much lengthier discussion in the rabbinic literature, is that the distinction God has made here is that during this 7th year, you can eat what grows, but you can't harvest it. You don't get to go out with your sickle and scythe and clean the field of all the wheat that's been growing naturally and stick it in your barn and use that for the next year. You don't get to do that. You don't get to go to your orchard and pull off all the apples and preserve them and salt them or dehydrate them and all that stuff. What you do get to do is you get to go out each day and you get to pick up a bunch of wheat that you need to make bread for that day. And you take it home and you grind it and you make your bread and you eat it. And tomorrow you get to do the same. And you know who else is doing that each day? Everybody else in your field and the other people's fields. You don't get to put a big fence around your field that says, this is my stuff that during the 7th year I'm eating from. Go find your own.
So, therefore you don't have a sabbatical. You're out there eating hand to mouth every day.
You're out there eating hand to mouth every day, which is another reason why Sforno was maybe looking more for inspiration than for literal description of what would have been happening. and why the reason for the sabbatical may be more than simply a spiritual connection with God. Because this is providing a very different kind of spiritual connection. This is providing us a spiritual connection with the poor. For 1 year, out of every cycle, we will know what it is like to be landless. For 1 year out of every cycle, we will know what it's like to not know how much food you have till tomorrow. We will know what it's like to go out and glean a few things rather than to enjoy an entire field full of harvest. We will know what it's like to pick a couple apples off a tree and be thankful for those few apples, because we don't know whether we can have the rest of the tree or not, because it's not ours.
Somebody else.
And someone else might pick it in the meantime. As my grandmother, may she rest in peace, used to say, she learned to eat fruit green in her neighborhood growing up, because if you waited for the fruit to ripen, someone else would have stolen it first. And she meant she was stealing it too. She taught me to eat green fruit for the same reason, because she learned to like green fruit, and she was the one who usually bought fruit for the house, and so I learned to like green fruit too. And I can still, I like a peach that snaps like an apple. I know, it puts everybody's teeth on edge, but trust me, it's no juice down the yard, and especially with the beard, it's a lot of good reasons. A nectarine should go crunch. It shouldn't go. If it goes like that, I hand it to Penelope or Hannah. I say, oh, I think this one's gone off, and they say, no, it went ripe. So there is that feeling of complete and absolute vulnerability and sympathy and empathy for the others around you. And let's go ahead. They're going to continue to see how this would have been put into practice.
Originally, the court would give everyone 3 meals worth of what they had gathered and collect the rest in storehouses in each city, even hiring workers to gather the figs, olives, and so forth as they ripened. They would then distribute the food every Friday to each house according to its needs.
All right, so let's make sure we have this picture, right? So originally, if you have a big enough town, the town court, the Beit Din, would organize this collection. They would have people go out and harvest. But the harvesters didn't get to keep what they harvested. It was brought back and distributed against the needs of the families. This was to prevent people from going out and hoarding. Remember, the big problem with 7 year 7 is fear. And the usual response in times of fear is hoarding. Right? I was told when I first got here that if there was ever a warning that a hurricane was coming or a bad storm, to make sure that I stocked up on toilet paper and water well in advance, because they would not be any in the store, come the few days before. That people would be buying more than you could ever possibly humanly use, but because we're afraid, and we want to make sure that we have enough stuff when we're afraid. And this was meant to prevent that. That you would have everybody gather, and everyone would deposit, and everyone would get a ration based upon the needs of their family, the size of the family, essentially. Onward.
But Rabbi Simeon says in the same passage that when the time for removal came, the rich would distribute produce to their neighbors.
That removal means when the amount that's in the fields are beginning to get to the bottom, and it's time to gather in the leftover so that it can be stored and then distributed by rationing. What would happen?
And bring out the rest to the entrance of their homes. They would declare, "Brother Jews, let everyone who needs come and take." After which they would put whatever was left back in their homes and go on eating until it was used up. We therefore learn explicitly that removal of the produce means declaring it ownerless.
All right, so this is a technical term, to declare it ownerless. If something is ownerless, you can't stop anyone else from taking it, because it doesn't belong to you. And they were alarmed that what was happening was the rich, and again, remember, rich doesn't mean top 1%. Rich means you own a field, that you have land. That what they would do was they would take and they would share it with their family and neighbors and friends, the people they wanted to, put some of it out that some people could come and take, and then after those people had taken, they'd hide the rest. And they would use that as their own personal store. And that's not appropriate, say our sages. That during the sabbatical year, we all live the same. During the sabbatical year, it doesn't belong to you. You're not allowed to hoard it. And to hoard it is not tantamount, but is literally stealing. because you are keeping it from the other legitimate owners that have a right to it. I know we have a hard time with this vision because property makes up an awful large part of how we conceptualize ourselves and how we direct our actions in the world, of making sure we protect what we have and making sure that we acquire what we want. And in many cases, make sure we even have what we need. But the sages here were basing themselves on that earlier statement of Sforno and Midrash Agada, that it doesn't belong to you in the first place. So you don't have the right to claim ownership when God has said it doesn't belong to you. That if the real owner says it belongs to everyone, if you hoard it, you are stealing. I know, hard to get our head around. All right, a little more.
The sages arranged the technical details of how this was done in various ways to make sure that no one would hold on to the produce or trade in it commercially. Again, in towns big enough for this to be feasible, the removal consisted of bringing the produce to the storehouse, since by this very action the original owner renounced his ownership.
Right, everyone throws it in the pot, so it's communally owned.
Rashi comments that removal consisted of leaving the produce in places where people and animals customarily pass by. After the time of removal, one who keeps such produce inside his house so that only he can eat it is absolutely forbidden to do so.
All right, so Rashi adds to this in his commentary that if you're in a town that isn't big enough or organized enough to have a food pantry like they're talking about, that what would happen is everyone would just drop the food off at like the crossroads. Good idea?
Well,
Yeah, but who else is eating it?
everybody.
But in addition to the everybody, there's an additional category added by Rashi's commentary, which goes back to our Torah verse that we probably overlooked. What else is eating it?
Animals.
Animals. Okay? Animals had a right equal to humans for the produce of the field during the sabbatical year. If you look back on page 739, at verse 7 of chapter 25, it says, after, the land will have, you can eat whatever the land during this will produce, you and your male and female slaves, the hired and bound laborers who live with you, and your cattle, which you might be thinking, okay, I'm feeding my livestock, and the beasts in your land, which in technical rabbinic terms, the beasts mean non-domesticated animals. The wolves and the bears and the deer and the ducks and other things that are not your domesticated animals, that they have a right to eat from the land as well. And you have no right to stop them from eating from that. During the regular year, put up your fences, keep the deers out of your garden, no problem. During the sabbatical year, no. You're not allowed to do that. During the sabbatical year, they have as much right to the produce of the land as you do. All right, hard? This is not exactly normative behavior in the modern world. Right, we like fences. We like the surety of knowing that what we planted will be harvested and we will be able to eat of our produce. I mean, that's used as a symbol even in the biblical text and other passages in the prophets as being a symbol of a surety, that you will plant and you will harvest. It is the sign of you'll be safe and you'll be at peace. And this is destroying that. I'm going to be out there picking through the food pile at the crossroads with the bear? I mean, really?
Does this apply only to Israel?
Yes. Yes. Make sure everyone heard this. This apply only to Israel? And the answer is yes. The taking care of the poor, the taking care of animals, etc. In other ways, we have responsibilities, but the Shemitah year and the Jubilee year, the Yovel, not outside of the land of Israel. That is something unique to our occupation of the land. And even Jews living outside of Israel are not obligated to this. It's only in Israel. Because the idea was that only in Israel could you possibly have the blessings of a land that would actually make the system work. You try to do this in Kansas, and you're going to starve. If not in this year, you're going to starve in the next two. And it was only in Israel where we believed that the land itself was so bountiful and so beautiful that this whole system could even function.
And indeed, today, the land is so much more abundant. The crops are so much more.
Absolutely. With the proper love and the proper care, the land of Israel is one of the most bountiful and fertile places on earth.
when I was down in the Negev,
Mm-hmm.
and we saw all those bare hills, it came to me, it says, that's like instant pasture. All
Mm.
it needs is God to put the rain on it.
Just
It's
waiting.
there. It'll be there.
Okay. Few minutes left. Let's go ahead and have one more continuation of Ramban here.
I've already explained in my comment to Genesis 2:3 that the 6 days of creation represent the duration of the world, and that the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God, Exodus 20:10, on which there will be a Sabbath of the great name. Just as the 7 days of the week allude to what God created in the beginning, so the 7 years of the sabbatical cycle allude to what will happen during all the rest of creation. That is why the text is so strict about it, invoking a penalty of exile for violating it. And this is repeated a second time in 26:34, again in 26:35, and yet again in 26:43. Pirkei Avot 5:9 confirms it. Exile comes for delay of justice, for perversion of justice, and for violating the sabbatical year.
All right, pause real quick. You know, anyone ever watched Sesame Street 20, 30 years ago? One of these things is not like the other. Pirkei Avot, delay of justice, perversion of justice, sabbatical year.
Yeah.
That's really a list? And what's going on that this has something to do with the creation, the 7 days of creation represent the duration of the world? What in the world is Ramban talking about? Well, let's see if we can't break this down a little bit. There's our sabbatical year. World history. The first 6 days of creation represent the normal course of the world's timeline. We're not at the end yet, unfortunately, because the seventh day is Olam Haba, is the days of the Mashiach, is the world to come. When it said that there were 6 days that were created and on the seventh day God rested, Ramban is saying that there are going to be 6 epochs of history, of time, of humanity living in the world as it is, and then there will be a seventh dawn of a new day that will be a new world. That will be the world to come. That will be a new life. This pattern is reflected in the sabbatical, says Ramban, which is why denying the sabbatical is so offensive in his and the sages' interpretation. Because if you deny the sabbatical, you are essentially denying this as an understanding of creation, an understanding of the world. To say that there is no world to come, you're saying that the current world is just a mishmash, that there was no creation, there was no plan, there was no creator. That's what you're saying when you don't let the seventh year lie fallow, according to Ramban. And this is an issue of justice, is what he's doing by bringing in Pirkei Avot, and what Pirkei Avot was doing when it first made the quote. That the sabbatical year is not just an issue of spiritual growth, it is a question of justice. It is a question of understanding this balance of creation in time and redemption, and what is meant to happen in the meantime. There is meant to be justice. Because, if we keep reading,
For anyone who does so denies God's work of creation and denies the world to come. Jeremiah spoke equally harshly, condemning them to exile for freeing their slaves and immediately re-enslaving them. For slaves are to enjoy release in the seventh year and at the Jubilee, just like the land.
okay, so he brings it back to say, I know we've been talking about this as a land ordinance and agricultural cycles, but you must understand that this is an issue not just of good farm husbandry. Farm husbandry? It's not just a good pattern of agricultural maintenance. And it's not even just about your own personal spiritual growth and satisfaction, or even your own personal spiritual acknowledgement of God. It is about what that is meant to do for you and for the world. It means you release the land, and it means you release each other. And you're not just releasing the slaves, but you're also releasing anyone who has been impoverished during this previous cycle. And by release, I mean returning to the means with which they are able to then support themselves. That they return to land and now have the means that they can build themselves up again. And to prevent that, to not release those that are enslaved or not return to those who were impoverished the tools that allow them to take care of themselves, to feed themselves, and to grow strong in themselves, is unjust. You can't just say, neener, 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 I landed on such and such a card on the Monopoly board, so now I own Boardwalk and you're done. And every time we play Monopoly ever again, I own Boardwalk when we start. No one wants to play that game with you anymore. Because it's not fair. And that's what the Torah is trying to remind us. That this is about justice. This is about ensuring that everyone has a fair shot. Doesn't mean people can't fail. But it does mean people cannot be buried by their failures and never be able to dig themselves out of it, nor their children, or their grandchildren, or any in perpetuity. Everyone has to have an opportunity, eventually, to be given a chance to wipe the board clean and start again. And if you take that away, it is unjust. Which we can get to hopefully see in our final halakha at the bottom of the page.
Selling a house in the city does not harm a man's sustenance, but house in the
Sorry, that should be a house.
a house in the open country are there for the purpose of protecting the fields and housing the agricultural workers. They therefore follow the rules about land and not those about houses.
All right, so remember I said at the very beginning that the house in the city and the house in the land. The house in the city, you got a year to change your mind and redeem it. House in the land, every 50 years, boom, it reverts to you automatically. Why? Because you don't need a house in the city to feed yourself. I know people who live in New York and such probably have a different opinion on that. But when it comes down to the base, again, the Torah is not trying to guarantee everyone wealth. It's trying to guarantee everyone the richness of being able to produce for themselves. Remember, that's what Ramban said rich means, that you have a piece of land. Rich doesn't mean you got a massive bank account. It doesn't mean you've got a penthouse suite. It means you have the means to provide for yourself. And you have the freedom to provide for yourself. So the Torah is not trying to guarantee everyone the penthouse suite, but it is trying to guarantee everyone that they have a chance to get back the opportunity to provide for themselves and in at least a subsistence level. So if you take that away, you're denying God his place as creator of the world. You're denying God as the giver of our chance to use this world. And you're denying the justice that is due to our fellow human beings.
In the garden, they were taken care of in the fact that all they had to do was tend the garden and they had all they needed to eat.
Correct? And it's
And
easy when
everything
you only
they
got
needed.
2 people.
Everything was supplied.
Everything was supplied. But we know that the status of the world now is that we live much of our life in fear that next year may be the 7th year. Many people are constantly afraid that I don't know if I can make a donation now. I don't know if I can volunteer now. I don't know if I can risk doing something that I think is right, but might put a dampener on my earning ability right now, because what if I lose my job next year? What if there's an unexpected medical expense? What if there is a natural disaster? I live in fear of the 7th year being tomorrow. And as such, we never release. We don't release ourselves, we don't release the slaves, we don't release those that are in poverty, because we don't know if we can risk it yet. Because next year might be worse. And by doing so, we perpetuate a system of injustice. You know, one of the beautiful things, this last Sunday, we had a Temple Israel program that Stephen Kluger had arranged at Feeding Children Everywhere, which is an organization just right opposite Lyman High School. And they take, and volunteers come in, and donations come in. The donations buy the raw ingredients for food, and the volunteers pack it in bags. And we did 4,000 meals. And all it took was people showing up to do the work. They aren't great meals. We got to taste them. They were kosher, all vegan and all great like that. And so lentil and vegetables and rice all mixed together into kind of a little porridge thing. But it tasted pretty good, and it certainly would help you survive. And we owe at least that to everyone. And we owe more than that to make sure that people can provide for themselves and not have to live off a tiny plastic bag of food for one meal, but can begin to provide for themselves. So it was good to participate in that, and we definitely will be partnering with them again. But we need to make sure that we see that as not as an act of charity, but as an act of justice. that we don't have a sabbatical year to kick us in the pants and a court that will prosecute us for daring to hoard food or eat from what belongs to everyone. So we have to self-regulate. It's harder, but it's no less a cause of justice. And we act out of justice, not simply out of kindness. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.